Hilchis para Adumah Peir Karboser. So now we're learning a new halacha, that is that the ephah of the para Adumah can't become tummy. Now normally it becomes tummy by coming into contact with something that's tummy. Over here there's a special din that the ephah of para Adumah says that v'hiniach michutz lamachne b'mokim Torah. Not only shouldn't it come into contact with tumah, but it has to be b'mokim Torah. So therefore, it can be a hechatimtza of something which finds itself in a place where normally the tumah doesn't go in there. But on the other end, the place where the keli is, which is containing this ephah para, is not mokum Torah, and therefore that passes also the ephah para, like we'll learn. Perik arbasa, kli cheres shahoya be ephah chatos. You have a kli cheres which has ephah chatos, and the kli cheres is not metamek tumah migabe. And v'noga be sheretz mitzidei, and lepel the sheretz touches this kli cheres from the side, is Torah. Why? She'en kli cheres metame migabe afilu legabe chatos. The din is that a kli cheres is not metame tumah migabe, and legabe this din there's no maila bechatas. Legabe chatas is also not metame tumah migabe. So if you have a sheretz that's touching a kli cheres from the side, and lepel in the kli cheres there's ephah para, so it's fine. The ephah para is Torah, and maila everything is fine. However, hiniach hakeli al gabi hasheretz. This kli cheres was placed on top of the sheretz. So lepel again, the sheretz is not being metame. The lechura, it's not coming into the kli sheretz because the kli sheretz is not mistame migabe. Is afal pishali nitma keli. The keli remains Torah, but nevertheless hariya ephah tummy. So now there's a new din that the ephah becomes tummy. Why? Shenamar v'hineach mechutz lamachne b'mokum Torah ve'ein ze mokum Torah. So even though the ephah didn't really come into contact with tumah, because the tumah never went into the aver of the kli cheres, but nevertheless, since lepel, the kli cheres, with the ephah which is on top, in the kli cheres, is lying on top of a sheretz, so as a result of that, the ephah becomes tumah. V'lei al gabi asheretz bilvad, not only a sheretz, which is avat tumah min atera, and lafili nichi al gabi echul sheni u'keitzebei. He put it on something which is echul sheni, or similar midvarim shetumasim to makala v'hem midvari seifim. We're talking about psasheni l'tumah and it's midrabana. Nevertheless, hari nitma ephah, the ephah becomes tummy, shenamer b'mokim Torah, which tells us shalei yi al gabi shum tumah b'elam. It shouldn't be on top of any tumah. So again, kli cheres is not mekabeh tumah migabe. So therefore, if you have a sheretz which is lying next to a kli cheres, and there's ephah of para adumah in this kli cheres, it's fine. Because lepel, it's not considered that the ephah is not b'mokum Torah. The fact that the sheretz is b'tzidei doesn't make it not b'mokum Torah, and lepel, the sheretz doesn't come into the kli cheres, not mekam the keli. So mele the ephah para adumah is fine. However, if this keli is lying on top of the sheretz, or not even on top of a sheretz, even on top of a oichel, which is a sheni l'tumah, so since lepel it's lying on top of a davar tamei, so felt in the mokim Torah, v'iniach mechutz lamachne b'mokim Torah. The mele, since it's not the mokum Torah, so even though the keli is not mekabel tumah, because it's not metabel kumah megabe, but the ephah becomes tamei because the ephah is no longer b'mokum Torah. That's this din. So if you have keli kli cheres that's lying on top of something that's tamei, it becomes, so the ephah becomes tamei. V'chein kli cheres shehoye be'ephah chatos v'nosun ala ruba shebebayis tamei. You have a bias which has tumah in it, tumah smes, so the bias is full of tumah. And now you have a kli cheres which is lying on top of the bias, topping aligning the bias, and it's going through the aruba which is in the bias. So lepel, the kli cheres is in the bias. The kli cheres is not makabel tuma migabe, but nevertheless, since the kli cheres is suspended into the bias, it's hanging in the bias. So therefore, the ephah which is in the kli cheres, which is in the aver of the bias, even though it's not really exposed to the aver of the bias, but lepel, it's lying in the aver of the bias. So that causes that the ephah should become tummy. That's this din. V'chein kli cheres shehoye be'ephah chatos, and v'nosen al aruba shebebayis, and it's lying on top of this opening in the roof. Shebebayis tummy is hoya keli mishul shulabayis. If this keli was suspended into the house, is nitma ephah. So the ephah which is in this keli, even though the pale is not exposed mamish to the tumah because it's not matami megabe, nitma ephah. V'afal pi she'en baruba pisech tefach. Even though there's no pisech tefach, but lepel, the keli is doch in the bias. So l'may nafkemina, if the opening is a pisech tefach or not. However, if it wasn't hanging, it was just lying on top. It was lying on top of this opening. So im hoye baruba pisech tefach. So if there's a pisech tefach in this aruba, so then the tumah could go out. So if the tumah could go out, so Mamela it comes out that the klicheres over here is now lying on top of the tumah. He's lying on top of the tumah. So Mamela, so the afer of the parah, which is in this klicheres, which is on top of the tumah, and this opening is a pesach tefach. So Mamela, so the tumah goes out of the opening, and Mamela the klicheres is lying on tumah. Halacha beis. Now this is talking about a klicheres. Now hoya keli sheleven. Ben sheyesh b'pisech tefach, ben she'ein bo hefer Torah. So Vices, this din is only going on the second din. We had two dinim. We had a din of being mishulshul in the bias, and we had a din when it's being on top of the bias, and it depends if there's a tefach or not. So on B'negei, the second din, the Rambam is saying that there's a chilik B'negei a kliyevin. That a kliyevin, since lepel, it's hard to understand. You have to understand because a kliyevin, a klicher is also not matamik tumim megabe. But nevertheless, the problem is because it's not a mokum Torah. So kliyevin is the also l'chura lepel sofkol, so it's not a mokum Torah. Vaisty, since a kliyevin can't be makabel tumah, so memelis, even though this kliyevin is on top of the bias and it's a pesach tefach, so then it's not considered that it's not a mokum Torah. Masha'inkim b'negei klicheres, since it's shaykh is makabel tumah miteichei, kliyevin is the mechalal makabel tumah. Since shaykh makabel tumah miteichei, so over there the din is that if it's a pesach tefach, so then it's tamin. If it's not a pesach tefach, then it's Torah. It's sarach beer. You have to understand the chiluk. The diak lashon Rambam is only b'negei the second din, not b'negei the first din. B'negei the first din, if it would actually be in the bias, suspended in the bias, vice versa, even a kliyavin would be tummy. It's just when it's on top of the bias, over there we make a chiluk. If it's a klicher, if it's a pesach tefach or not. So on that the Rambam is being mechalik whether or not we're talking about a klicheres or a kliyavin. Halacha gimel v'chein keli sheyesh be'efer imayim mekudoshim. Umukav tzamet pasel v'nosen be'elames, and we learned before that if you have a keli which is a mukav tzamet pasel, either a klicheres which is not metamek tumah megabe, or a kliyevin which is b'chlal not mekabel tumah and it's mukav tzamet pasel, so the tumah doesn't go inside. The memela, what's inside is remains Torah. And those by a klicheres, the chiddush is that the keli remains Torah, and b'negei a kliyevin, the chiddush is that the oichel which is in the keli also becomes Torah, and lepel it's nosen be'elames. So the din is Ariya Efer v'amayim tmeim. The Efer and the Mayim Kudoshim are tamei. She'ein achatos nitzeles b'tzamet pasel. She'namber b'mokum Torah. Ve'ein zeh mokum Torah. So if it finds itself in the house, so even though it's in a tzamet pasel, and normally a tzamet pasel is makiv, that the matzil, that the tumah shouldn't go in, but nevertheless over here it's felt in mokum Torah. And memela it's pasel. And again over here is meduyik, that this din is any keli, lav dafka klicheres, like even a kliyavin. So the chiluk between the kliyavin and the klicheres is only when it's on top of the bias. Mashenkin, if it's in the bias, so, and it's summit puzzle or suspended in the bias, like in the case where we had an halacha aleph, where it was actually suspended through that hole, so then, even if it's a kliyavin, also it becomes tamei if it's mechatus or efer par adum. Halacha dalet, v'chein, oichlin umashkin shel kedesh, another din has nothing to do with par adum, oichlin umashkin shel kedesh, Einon nitzol b'tzamet pasel. We learn out also over there has to be mokum Torah. So eichlin and mashkin shel kedesh don't become nitzol b'tzamet pasels. Even though normal eichlin and mashkin are nitzol b'tzamet pasel, mashenkin of shel kedesh einon nitzol b'tzamet pasel. Avol mayim she'einon mekudash. If you have water that you took for the mechatos and you weren't mekadosh it yet, there was no kiddush mechatos yet, or ukli reikon haTorah lechatos. You have a kli reikon which you use Torah lechatos. You are machbul lechatos, but lepel is a kli reikon. So the din is nitzel b'tzamet pasel. That is nitzel b'tzamet pasel. So if you have a kli reikon, which is let's say, and lepel there's a tzamet pasel on it, and it finds itself ba'el ames, so it's Torah. And al derech zeh, if you have mayim she'ena mukudashim, and it's in a keli which is tzamet pasel, so again, so the mayim still remains roy to be mekadosh with mechatos. Now b'medvar mamurim that you could be mekadosh mechatos with mayim which are ena mekudashim. Those mayim which are ena mekudashim that finds itself in a bias tomei, but it's mukav tzomet pasel. So we're saying that mayim remains roy to be mekadosh mechatos. That's only b'shahoyu abaylim teir. If the baylim remain Torah, which means the baylim, let's say the baylim weren't in the house with the mayim. Avalim nitmo abaylim, but if the baylim became tomei, so there's another din that a baylim that are tomei can't really have mayim which are roy l'kadosh mechatos. Whereas if they are really the shemim, if they designate a shemer, so then it doesn't make a difference. But if they are the shemim, and normally the bailim are the shemim on their water, So if the bailam, you can't have a shemer on mayim which are royal lekadosh mechatos if the person is tummy. That's this din. Aval nitnu abailim is nifsul amayim b'chol makom shein ketzad. Hoyu meimav mukafin summit pasli. A person has water, which that water was drawn in order to be mekadosh with mechatos. And lepel, the water is mukav summit pasli. V'hu v'heim ba'elames, and they're both in this elames. So the din is shneim tmei. So he's tamei because he's in the elames. And the water is tummy, even though the water lechura should be torah, because mukav tzamid pasel is matzel mayim, which are ena mukudashim. But since its bailam are tummy, so memela the water is tummy. However, hayuhumi b'chutz v'mayim she'ena mukudashim b'bifnim. So then it's shneim teirim. The mayim is tahir because it's a mukav tzamid pasel, and he's tahir because he's b'chutz. Now who b'fnim v'mayim b'chutz? So then kshem shehu tummy kach meim psulim, because lepel the psul of the mayim is because they're bailim. And the person that's in charge of them is tummy. So that, kids, we're learning two dinim over here. Within be'etzem ikra the dina, mukav tzamid pasel could be matzel mayim, which were not niskadish for mechatas, they're only nismalul of mechatas. That mayim doesn't become tummy if it's in a mokim tummy, if it's in a mukav tzamid pasel. But on the other end, a person that's tummy can't have mayim which are nismalu lemechatos, if he's in charge of it. The Ram doesn't say that, but that's brought down. That if he was mamana or shemer, so just like he could do malacha, he can become tamei. Mashenkin, he can't be under the shmira of an adam tamei. But if he's the shemer, he's the bailam, he's the shemer, so then those mayim become psul. Halacha hey. So we learned that if the mayim, if the mechatos rather, or the afer of the para, were on a mokim tamei, so even though be'etzim normally they shouldn't become tamei because they're in a summit puzzle or they're in a klicheres which is not makabel to megabe and they're not in an oilames, but nevertheless since it's not in a mokum toir, so it becomes tamei. Now hatoir lechatos, someone that's toir lechatos shoyoymed al gabi atanur, he's standing on top of a tanur which is tamei, the tanur which is tamei. Ukiyetzabe Mikelim she'enam tehirim lechatos. It's a keli which is not torah lechatos. So legabi chatos, it's considered that he's standing on a makom tummy. Now upashet yodei chutz letaner, ukeli sheyesh be'mechatos biyodei. Now he has a keli sheyesh be'mechatos. He's holding onto a keli sheyesh be'mechatos. But though the keli which has the mechatos is not really in the airspace on top of the tanner. It's being held in the hand of a person that's standing on top of the tanner. That's one situation. V'chein, another situation is a kana, you have a stick. Hamutal agabli tanner, which is lying across the tanner. Ushnei kelim sheyesh be'mechatos tluyim bei. In order for them to balance each other, so you give them a case of two kelim, you have two kelim, each one has mechatos. And again, both of them are not lying over the airspace of the tanner. They're not lying on the tanner. They're not lying over the airspace of the tanner. But they're being held by somebody which is standing on top of the tanner, or by something which is lying on top of the tanner. So the din is arei elu tmei. So this the mechatos, which comes puzzle because they're not in a mokim torah, so they become tamil. Because since the person, even though the person which is holding them is standing on this tanner which is not torah lechatos, or the kana which is holding them is standing on top of the person, on top of the tanner, which is not Torah lechatos, so it's keilu, it's that this keli is on a mokim sheini Torah, hail v'hein l'sharon al tanner, because since they're leaning on the tanner, in other words, they're being held up by the tanner, is arei hein keilu munachim al gavur. They have it in as if they were munachim al gavur. That's talking about, so even though it's not over the airspace of the tanner, but since it's being supported by the tanner, in other words, by the person that's standing on the tanner, or by the kana which is lying on the tanner, since it's being supported by the tanner, so therefore they become tummy. Now, fakert, if they are in the airspace and they're not supported, then they don't become tummy. In other words, in order to become tummy, to be considered that it's not in a makom torah, it has to be supported by this not makom torah. Like we had the original case, where you have a keli which has the efer apara and it's lying on the sheretz. So the sheretz is holding it up, or it's lying on the oichel which is sheni l'tumah. So that's holding it up. We have this case over here where the person is standing on the tanner and he's holding the keli, even though the keli is not over the airspace. A person is standing on a tanner. No, it's going to Hamshach. Aber Hoya Emed al Ataner. V'yodi klirei k'natoy lechados. Emayim she'enim kudoshim is arelu teirim k'mishayu. That's bepashtus, because only the son of Mokim Toyer is only benegeya the mechatos or the efer of the mechatos. Masha'enkin mayim, which weren't niskadish yet, it's just nismali, or the keli, which is an empty keli and it's Torah lechatos, doesn't become tamei. That's what we learned before, that if they would be in the oil ames and they would be tzomit pasul, they would be Torah. Now hoya oimed, this is what we said before, was the next halacha. Hoya oimed chutz l'taner. Person is not standing on the taner. Now upashid yodi lechalein. He goes, he extends his hand to the chalein, and benotel keli sheyesh be mechatos beheviri al gabi ataner. So lepel, this keli which has mechatos was passed over this tanner. It was passed over this tanner. So the din is areza Torah. So even though it was passed over the tanner and it was over the airspace of the tanner, but being over the airspace of the tanner doesn't disqualify it from being mechatos or efer apara. That's not considered that it wasn't b'mokum Torah, because it wasn't lying on there. It was just in the airspace. V'chein hazoyeh she'over al gabi tumah. If you have a person is being maza on a tummy, and he passes over an area which is tummy, so l'chura he's passing over the airspace of something that's tummy. Is again mishkav v'meishim v'keitzman, even something which is serious tumah, but mishkav v'meishim. But nevertheless, is arezu teira, because again it wasn't lying, it wasn't being supported by something tummy. Since it wasn't being supported by something tummy, so therefore it's not tummy. That's the chiddush. Now the emes is the two halachas, the same halacha. The side when he's carrying it over, and side when he's throwing it. Either way, the nekudas advarim is that it's not lying, it's not being supported by something that's tummy, and therefore it's not considered, it's not a chsar legabi being b'mokim Torah. The Ma'aseh has been again this din. The Gemara says that the Rambam says that in Pirush Mishnayos also that this din is connected to the din of klutik mishahuncha. Whereas the din of klutik mishahuncha is brought down in the style legabi Hilchos Shabbos, the sheet of Rabbi Akiva, that something is in the airspace of a certain rishus has a din as if it's muncha in that rishus. Al that is over here, something that's in the airspace over the tanner, there's a svara to say klutik mishahuncha. Mela comes out that there's two chidushim over here. In the case where a person moves his hand over the tanner, so over there could be there's no art to say klutik mishahuncha, because since lepel, the body is in one place and the hand is in another place, so there's a din of yadi basagufi garer, so that stops the union of kluta. I'll call upon him, so memela over there's no din kluta. So the chiddush is no, even in a case where there's no hand holding it, rather it's going over the airspace because he was mazid. Nevertheless, it's not considered not b'makom Torah, because we don't say this din of kluta legabi this din. Halacha vov. Keli sheyesh be mechatos, v'keli sheyesh be kodesh shenagu zeh b'zeh. Now we say a keli that's for kodesh is still tummy for chatos. So memela hari nitma keli shel chatos. The keli shel chatos becomes tummy because the keli shel kodesh legabi chatos has a din of tummy, and it could be metame the keli shel chatos. And also the chol sheyesh be avol klei hakedesh, but the klei hakedesh is still Torah shekayim. So anachma, you have a keli which of kodesh, and then you have a keli which is a keli shel chatos. So the din is that the keli shel chatos becomes tamei, and anything that's in that keli also becomes tamei. But on the other, the keli shel kedesh is the keli for kedesh. So the gabi kedesh, it's still Torah. It's Torah shehaya. V'cheinem noga haTorah lechatos b'shtei yadav. A person that's a Torah lechatos touches both kelim at the same time. Kshem munachim alaretz while they're lying on the ground. So he's touching with one hand the keli of kedesh, and with the other hand is touching the keli of chatos. So the din is ari nitma shel chatos. So the keli of chatos becomes tamei. Why? Shari haTorah lechatos nitma b'negias hakeli she'ein Torah lechatos. By him touching with one hand that keli which is of kodesh, which is not Torah for chatos, he becomes tamei lechatos. And now, once he's tamei for chatos, is v'chazav v'timi is me'achatos. And now he's metamei the me'achatos by touching that keli which has the mechatos. And memela he's being metamei. He's metamei the keli plus the mechatos. Now he went ahead and he was magia both hands. Notice, at this point in time, the keli of Kedesh still is Torah. Lepel, the keli of Kedesh is still Torah because Lepel, he became Tamei legabi chatos by touching the keli shel Kedesh. And Memela, through that, he was able to be Matamei, the keli of chatos. But on the other hand, the keli of Kedesh still remains Torah. Why not? I mean, just like in the case before where the keli of Kedesh touched the keli of chatos, So who adin when the keli of kodesh touched a person, and that person touched the keli shel chatos, is also tar. The keli of kodesh remains tar. Now we're going to bring out a case where through the fact that it became tamei, so memela it became the keli of kodesh also becomes tamei. Halacha zayin. Now we learned in the first two cases, the two cases in halacha vav, over there say when the keli of kodesh touched the keli that had chatos in it. And say when a person which was Torah lechatos touched the keli of kodesh, and at the same time was touching the keli of chatos. So the din is that the keli of chatos became tummy, either because it touched the kodesh which wasn't Torah lechatos, or it touched the person which touched the kodesh which wasn't Torah lechatos. So mele it became tummy. But on the other hand, the keli of kodesh remained Torah. Now in halacha zayin, we're going to learn a case where the keli of kodesh also becomes tummy, and that is because it's based on the halacha. The halacha is when a person picks up main nida means the mayim mukudashim. So if it's not l'tzeir chazor, if it's l'tzeir chazor, he doesn't become tummy. When a person's mazel with main nida, he doesn't become tummy, as we'll learn in the Hamsham Perek Tezvav. Mashenka, when he picks it up shalei l'tzeir chazor, so then he becomes tummy. Once he becomes tummy, so then he can be matami. Also, the keli of kedesh, not mitzad because it's a special din of tummy lechatos. No, he becomes tummy mamish. And memelis and havatuma we learned. And Memela, so he'll be able to be matami. He'll be matami the keli of kedesh. That's his din. Halacha zayin. Higbia shnei akelim b'shnei yadim. He picked up both kelim. So the din is shneim tmeim. Now both of them will be tami. Why? Zeh shel chatos nitma. Why is the chatos tami? Mepnei shenaga beyadam, shenaga bekeli sheinu torah lechatos. Just like when they're both lying on the ground, so the chatos becomes tami because naga beyadam, shenaga bekeli sheinu torah lechatos. Over here also he was naga in this. The person that picked them both up was naga in the keli, which is a kli, which is for chatas, and lepeil he also touched the kli kedesh, which wasn't tar lechatas. Now, why is v'shal kedesh nitma? Why is the kedesh become tamei? Mipnei zeh shehigbia, the person that's picking up the kedesh, v'hu tamei b'nesias meinida. He became tamei by the fact that he carried the meinida. He carried the meinida shalei l'tzeir chazor shehem etamim b'masa. The din is when a person carries those meinida, which is shalei l'tzeir chazor, so he becomes tamei. Why? Who says that it's shalei l'tzeir chazor? Who says he's picking up the kli meinida shalei l'tzeir chazor? Says it can't be l'tzeir chazor. Mipnei shenitma machmas akeli shel kedesh. So this ma'im are not going to be able to be maz on it. So mele is obviously he's not picking it up l'tzeir chazor. So if he's not picking it up l'tzeir chazor, so he becomes tamei. Once he becomes tummy, so Memeli is metami, the keli shel kedesh. Lefichach hoya keli shel kedesh karev b'niyar. So basically, everything started by the fact that he became tummy. He became tummy by touching the keli shel kedesh. Now, when he touched the keli shel kedesh, so now he goes ahead and touches the keli of chatos. It also becomes tummy. And now, once the keli chatos becomes tummy, so obviously it's not l'tzeir chazor because it's tummy, because it so can't be l'tzeir chazor. Once it's not l'tzeir chazor, so Memeli is metami the kedesh. If it was wrapped in niyar, which is not mekabel tuma, he picked up the kedesh with niyar, v'lei nagabe, he never touched the kedesh shel kedesh. And now the higbia chatas biyod shniya, shneim teirim. Sharili nagabe keli, he never touched the keli of kedesh. And memela v'lei nitmal chatas, so he never became tamil lechatas. And once he didn't become tamil lechatas, so memela, so nothing happens. So memela, the keli of chatas is still a royal. It be a keli of chatas. Is there a keli of chatas? And he was the Torah lechatas. And memela, and he's not being nitma, obviously, because he's picking it up shalei l'tzeir chazor. We'll have to say it's the l'tzeir chazor. Avalim hoy negeh b'kli hakedesh b'yodei b'lepel, if he would have been touching the kli hakedesh b'yodei, afil l'shoyel shel chatos b'niyar. The fact that the chatos b'niyar is shneim tmeim, anyways he's going to be tummy. Because lepel, since lepel he's touching the keli of kodesh, which he becomes tummy. So once he becomes tummy, so mele by picking up the keli shel chatos, so the keli shel chatos is now on a makom tummy. Is a person that's tummy. It's lying on a person that's tummy. So the keli shel kedesh becomes possible. Once the keli shel kedesh becomes possible, so again the keli shel kedesh becomes tummy. Halacha ches heiset the shnei akelim biyodei v'lei nagabem. So then the shneim teirim. Whereas the whole yesod of the tumah is happening because he touched the keli that had kodesh. Now that keli that had kodesh is not metame through the fact that with masa. If that keli would have been a keli which is royal medres, so then it's matame b'masa. But a regular keli is not matame b'masa. There was a keli which is not meyuchid lechatas, is not matame b'masa unless it's a keli which is royal medres. So Mela, by touching that keli, he becomes tamei, and Mela is matame the other keli, and Mela that causes that he should be able to be that it be matame also the keli of kodesh. Masha'en came if he was only hisid halacha ches hisid the shnei keli biyadei v'lei nagabem shneim teirim she'en keli she'en torah lechatas matame is a torah lechatas. A keli which is not torah lechatas is not going to be matame someone that's torah lechatas at sheyiga biyadei unless he touches it. Elim Kain, or Roy Lamedus, unless it was Roy Lamedus. And Lechura, that's also Muchach in what we said before, that if it was Keli, Shal Kalish was Karev Ben Yar, so he never touched it. So even though he was Hisit, he was Hisit, but Lepel, it wasn't Metameyim, because we're not dealing with a Keli, which is Roy Lamedus, which would be Metamey through Masa. Halacha Tes, Kol Sofik Hatumis, Shutor Legabitum Kamishi Yizbor. When you have a Sofik, Legabi Truma could be three ifan. It could be a suffix which you really disregard the suffix. It's not really a suffix. It doesn't have a din suffix, and therefore it has a din of tor, and you could go ahead and eat the truma. That's one madrega. Then you can have a madrega of a suffix in truma, which is a proper suffix, which means you're not really sure if it's tor or tame. So therefore, on one hand you can't eat it because if it's truma tamei, you're not allowed to eat it, and on the other hand you can't burn it. Because if it's not truma tamei, it's truma teiri, and you're not allowed to burn it. And then there's a madrega of truma, which the suffix we paskin that the truma is nisrefes. So he says as a kol suffix hatumis shehu tor legabi truma k'mishi yizbar, that we don't reckon zach with this suffix. So even though there's many chumras legabi chatos, but this just like a truma, a suffix of truma, which you would say that it has a din of tor, and therefore you're allowed to eat the truma, is hareu tor lechatos legabi chatos. It's also considered tor, and therefore you're allowed to use the mechatos, and that'll be matar, even though there was a suffix that was nailed. And b'chol ha-sveikas shetoil naleim is a truma, and those sveikas which there's a suffix on the truma, which means that you, on one hand you don't eat the truma, and on the other hand you don't burn it, because there's a suffix, you're not sure if it's tmei or teira. So if nailed the bechatos, if they were nailed the bechatos, they're in lishpachim, because there's no problem. By truma you can't burn it, but on the other hand by chatos it's lishpachim. Now v'im nasu taris al gabi oisom kelim ve'odom shenel dulam sveikaselu shachatas nishpachan aleim. If this madrega of there was an odom ve'kelim that Be'emes has this madrega of suffix, which on that you would say that meichatas would nishpach aleim. So the tzir could be really two tzirim. You could have a tzir where you had meichatas and there was a suffix whether or not it was tummy or it became tummy or tor. So really the din should have been that these mechatas are nishpachan aleim, and then you went ahead and used this mechatas, and you will retire a person that was a tmei mess. So really there's a suffix, that same madrega of a suffix, whether he really became tor, and now that person went ahead and used truma, where it was touched truma. So memela, that truma is a suffix tamei, memela, so it's tailin. On one hand you're not allowed to eat it, and on the other hand you're not allowed to burn it. Al derez it could be that the person directly became tamei with that madrega of tuma, and then he touched also, then he touched. No, this din could be, and then he went ahead and he touched taris. In other words, im nasu taris, al gabi oisen kelim ve'odam, shenil dulim sveikaselu, this madrega of suffix, shachatas nishpachan aleim, or that the trum is tailin le'echlin v'le'serfin. How did that suffix happen? Again, as we're saying, either because the mechatas which they were retire him was such a madrega of mechatas, or really there could have been the tum itself directly was on this adam and such a madrega of suffix. So the din is areis, not taras plus. That's this din. Then the Rambam continues and he said, I'm not sure where this din comes in here, but refafis einam kekelim. Refafis are like things that are made out of lattice. Sometimes you put it against the window so you should be able to look out and not look in. Talkolpan harafafis einam kekelim, and therefore v'harei hein teheres l'truma u'lekedesh u'lechatas, that refafas aren't mekabel tuma, and therefore if they touch chat, someone tummy touched them, and then they went ahead and touched chatas, it doesn't become tummy. Halacha yud dveila shel truma shenaflo l'teich mechatas v'noch klova ochla. So you have a dveila of truma that falls into mechatas, and then the person goes ahead and takes this dveila and he eats it. So here it depends. Let's just first learn the halacha. It's a little bit complicated. Im yesh bo kebetza, if this dveila shel truma has a kebetza, so then hamayim the mechatas are tmei, because the rule is that only something that's a kabetza of oichel can be metame acherim. If it's less than a kabetza, so it's not metame acherim. So in order for this dvela to be metame this mechatos, it has to be only if the dvela is a kabetza, is nachamol. Im yeshbo kabetza, if there was a kabetza in this dvela, so then hamayim tmeim the mechatos are tame, ben shehoisa dvela tmeya, ben shehoisa teira. Either way, the mayim are going to be torah. Why? Shekola echel nafilo echel kedish doch eine torah lechatos. So this dvela is going to go ahead and be metame the mechatos. That's din number one. This dvela is definitely metame the mechatos, whether the dvela was tame or the dvela was torah. Then the Ram continues, the person that's going to eat this dvela, now the person that's going to eat this dvela is chayav misa. Why is he chayav misa? Mipnei sha'achal truma v'hu kvar nitma b'mei nida. He's becoming tummy by being metaltal the main nida shalela tzerech hazoya. Now this main nida is not really royal hazoya, because this main nida became tummy through the dvela. So lepel, since this main nida became tummy through the dvela, so mele, it's obviously he's being metalking it shalela tzerech hazoya. So therefore he becomes tummy, and the pashtus advarim seems like he's becoming tummy on a deraisadik level. Because the Ram is saying va'oichle is chayiv misa. Pashtus means it's chayiv misa b'idei shemayim, because lepel he's being metaltal meinida. That's the first din. Then the Ram says, however, ve'im ein bo kibetza, if this truma, the dvela shel truma didn't have a kibetza, so there wasn't metami amayim b'tarosim she'eno oichel metami sacherim at sheyeh kibetza bein letruma bein lekedesh bein lechatos. So this din that you need an oichel of a kibetza to be metame doesn't make a difference. Always chul and truma kedesh, and chatas. Always you need a kibetza in order to be metame. That's this halacha. So let's go over the din again. Nachamol. The din that a dvela of truma tmeya that fell into mechatas, and then he went ahead and picked up this dvela, and he was in his not levachlo. So l'chura, if we're dealing with a dvela which is tamei, a dvela shel truma shenafel techmai chatas not levachlo, so l'chura, the question is, how could you say that you're chayiv misa b'dei shemayim for eating this dvela because he became tamei? L'chura, the din is that a person that's tamei that eats truma tmeya is not chayiv misa b'dei shemayim. That's what the Mefarshim asks. The Kes Mishnah asks. Others ask that l'chura, someone that's tamei that eats something that a truma tmeya is not chayiv misa b'dei shemayim. So Mikmel, you're going to have to say that v'hoichle chayiv misa is only talking in the case where the dvela shel truma was toy. So even though the Ram starts off and he says dvela shel truma tmeya, a dvela shel truma that falls into the mechatas, it always is metame the mechatas whether the dvela was tummy or the dvela was tar. So the mechatas taka becomes tummy whether the dvela was tummy or the dvela was tar. But lepeil, this din of ha'ichle chayiv misa is only going when the dvela was tar. When the dvela was tar, so then ha'ichle is chayiv misa because he's eating a dvela teira. He's eating a dvela teira and he's tummy. Why is he tummy? He's tummy because he was nitma b'mei nida, because he became nitma b'mei nida. And this din is negeh for both ways. Now, first of all, only so knows the dvela is not really tummy minatera. The dvela is not tummy. Since the dvela is not tummy, so therefore he becomes, for eating this dvela which is not tummy, and he's tummy minatera. Why is he tummy minatera? Because he was metaltal mei nida. So therefore he's chayav misa. Now this din is negeh also behemshech, because we're going to learn that someone that's metaltal mei nida, which is not royal hazoya, is also doesn't become tummy. This din of being metaltal mei nida, that it become tummy, is only mei nida which is royal hazoya. So l'chura, since this mei is a shaila, since this mei nida became tummy, if this mei nida became tummy, so why is he chayav misa? If this mei nida became tummy, how could you say that he became tummy? Because he's being metaltal mei nida, which is not l'tzerech hazoya, but he's being metaltal mei nida, which is not tzerech, which is not royal hazoya because it's tummy. So therefore, you're going to have to learn both ways. In other words, there's two reasons why this second din v'ha'oichle chayiv misa neisha'achol truma v'ukvar nitma is talking about truma, talking about the truma which wasn't tummy. First of all, because if the truma would have been tummy, so therefore, even if he would have really been tummy menatera, so you're not chayiv misa for someone that's tummy menatera that eats truma tmeya. That's din number one. And din number two is if that truma was really tummy, so then that truma was really metame on minatera dika level, the meinida. Now, if that meinida became tame on a minatera dika level, so the person that's touching this meinida is not going to become tame, because you're not becoming tame for being metaltal meinida, which is tame. If the Rambam says that clearly in the next parak, that if a person is metaltal meinida, which is tame, so he doesn't become tame from the din of meinida, which meinida is metame. The meinida itself is not going to be metame because it's not metame a person just by touching it. This is certainly not on a minatedika level. Nachmo, if a person touches meinida, which is tame, so he's not going to become tame without the din of being metaltal meinida. When a person is negeya or noisei, a meinida, which is roy lazoya, so then he becomes tame minatera. It's an avatuma minatera. That's only meinida, which is roy. So again, so let's go over the halach. Dveila shel truma shenaflu tech mechatas v'notel v'achla. Is im yesh bo kebetza. If there was a kebetza in this dveila shel truma, is a mayim tmeim. The mayim is tame. Ben shoysa dveila tmei, ben shoysa teira. Because the rule is shkol eichel nafil eichel kedesh in yitor lechatas. So the gabi the mayim is definitely tame regardless. Now v'hoichel, now it's not so glottic, but the Yichud you're going to have to learn. That's how the Mefarshim learn. V'hoichel is someone that eats this dveila when it was toher. So it's a dveila shel truma shenafel tech mechatos, and it was toher. V'hoichel, and a person goes ahead and eats it. Is chayiv misa. He's chayiv misa. Why? Mipnei she'achal truma, because he ate truma. V'hu kvar nitma b'meinida. He's eating truma teira, and he became tamei b'meinida. How did he become tamei? Because he was metaltal meinida. When does he become tamei? When he's metaltal the meinida? Again, only if the truma was teira. So there's two reasons why this din has to be talking about a truma teira. First of all, if it's truma tmeya, so then a tamei that eats truma tmeya, a tamei that eats truma tmeya doesn't become tamei. Secondly, if it was truma tmeya, he wouldn't be tamei, because he's only tamei for being metaltal the meinida, and meinida which is roy lazoya. If the truma was really tmeya, so the meinida wouldn't have been roy lazoya, so he wouldn't have been tamei. So therefore, we're talking about someone that eats this truma which is tahira, the truma which is tahira, and therefore, and he's tamei because he was metaltal meinida which weren't tamei menatera. So therefore, he's chayiv misa. That's only when it's talking about him yesh bo kebetza. Mashenkim that doesn't have a kebetza, so then it never became tamei. On any level, it didn't become tamei at all, because the din is that only a kebetza is matame.